You have a picture in your head of the Amazon, a seamless green ocean, a place where human footprints dissolve under a million leaves. You think of rivers and endless canopy, of the handful of villages that fringe the water, not of avenues, plazas, or the skeletal geometry of a city laid out across acres of cleared earth. That's the expectation, and it's an expectation that has been overturned again and again in recent decades. But the surprise I want to take you into begins with a screen glow in a small field office, with an aerial map full of color-coded ridges and depressions, and with that first breathless line, LiDAR has revealed regular, human-made geometry where we thought only wilderness existed. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a stubborn, brilliant tool. It punches through the canopy with millions of infrared pecks and returns a picture of what lies beneath the leaves: terraces, causeways, plazas, canals. And when those patterns snap into place, a new question opens: who built this? And why did their city vanish so completely that centuries later a satellite laser has to convince us it was ever there? Imagine being there the night the LiDAR image appears. The room is small. Outside, frogs are calling, a distant engine hums through the wet darkness. A scientist taps the screen and zooms in on a perfect ring of mounds, an axis aligned with a river bend, an enormous, rectilinear plaza 20 hectares across that looks like an idea of a city that forgot how to exist in our maps. The word "lost" is dangerously romantic, but it fits. The image feels like a wound opened in the Earth's skin, revealing bones that tell a story in strange geometry. Tonight I want to walk with you through that story, not as a parade of facts but as a slow descent into the data, into the theories, into the myths that beg to be believed. Along the way we will meet archaeologists in field shirts, elders who keep oral stories half-remembered, metal detectors that beep over nothing, and looters who walk the same soil with a different hunger. We'll consider trade routes that cross rivers the way veins cross a palm, and social systems that must have been complex enough to plan plazas and canals. We'll talk about radiocarbon dates and about the way a single shard of pottery can argue for contact with distant peoples. I promise you revelations that will feel both scientific and uncanny. We will find evidence of extensive urban planning in the middle of what most maps still label wilderness. We will find signs that these centers were not isolated hamlets but hubs of trade, ritual, and craft. We will uncover artifacts that suggest long-distance contact: beads, exotic stones, traces of metals in a place most textbooks once insisted had no metallurgy. But alongside these discoveries we will confront stubborn gaps: whole neighborhoods that yield no burials, ritual deposits that refuse to tell whether they were offerings or refuse, streets oriented to astronomical events that don't match any simple calendar we know. For every dataset that seems to answer, 3 new questions will appear on the screen. That is the nature of archaeology. It hands you a ladder of facts and dares you to climb into the dark between them. And here, in the shadow of tall trees and with laser points scattered like constellations, those gaps are especially wide. Picture yourself standing on the lip of one of the cleared plazas the LiDAR hinted at. The air is thick with humidity. The smell of wet soil presses its way into your skin. In the low light, the plaza looks like a stage where something happened and then stopped mid-scene. You can almost hear drums echoing through the night, feel the footfalls of a crowd, imagine fires arranged in a ceremonial ring. Imagine further that beneath the plaza there is a buried network of terraces and channels, irrigation, drainage, or ceremonial water, that follow a pattern precise enough to suggest planning, but organic enough to insist on local adaptation. That contradiction will be the heartbeat of our story: precise geometry embedded in an environment that seems to resist order. It isn't the only paradox we will meet. There are similar paradoxes in trade items that traveled thousands of kilometers across rivers and forests, in dietary remains that show domesticated plants existing alongside wild resources, in massive earthworks that must have required large labor forces yet leave few signs of social inequality. We still don't know how fast populations rose and fell here, or why some centers flourished into complexity while others remained small. The only certainty is that the Amazon we thought we knew is not the whole story. Now, let's be fair, calling a discovery a lost city sells headlines. But LiDAR doesn't lie, it simply translates canopy into topography. When archaeologists saw those repeating patterns, causeways running in straight lines for kilometers, rectangular compounds, concentric mounds, they felt the same pulse of excitement that explorers have felt for centuries. Still, for all the evidence, the ground keeps some of its secrets. There are places where LiDAR shows a perfect orthogonal plan, but excavation finds mainly earthworks used for farming, not habitation. There are causeways that lead to nowhere we can see, roads that join small plazas rather than large centers, and terraces that end in swampy ground. Those anomalies force us to rein in our most romantic hopes and demand sober explanation. One tool illuminates, but it also refracts. At this point you might be asking, who were these people? When did they live? The simplest answer is that many of these urban phenomena fall in the late Holocene, roughly the last 2,000 years, a time when changing climates and human ingenuity combined to make new social forms possible. Some dates suggest fluorescence between c. AD 800 and AD 1500, but other sites seem older, and a few may have been continuously occupied longer than that. That gives us a sense of scale, centuries of development, not a single fleeting season. Names matter in archaeology, and so do categories. You may hear terms like complex societies, chiefdoms, or regional polities. Those are not romantic adjectives. They are ways to talk about levels of organization. At the newly revealed city, measurements suggest planned plazas measuring tens of hectares, causeways several meters wide and raised above floodplains by as much as 3 meters, canals that redirect water in ways suggesting both flood control and symbolic design. There are also isolated mounds that may have been elite residences or communal structures. The population implied by these structures could have numbered in the tens of thousands at the peak, spread across a landscape of villages connected by the same engineered roads. But how do we interpret artifacts that seem out of place? At one excavated locus, investigators found a cache of beads made from a mineral native to distant uplands, and at another site fragments of ceramics whose paste contained temper not local to the valley. Trade seems to have reached further than expected, perhaps along river corridors that acted like highways. This challenges the old image of the Amazon as an island of small, isolated communities. Instead, it paints a picture of networks and exchange, of ritualized gifting, of material circulation that bound distant regions together. Yet we must be cautious. Trade does not automatically equal empire. Many of these networks could have been based on reciprocal exchange, pilgrimage, or the movement of specialists, rather than on coercive domination. Still, for all the evidence, the social mechanisms, how leaders organized labor for earthworks, who controlled the canals, how surplus was stored and redistributed, remain puzzling. Let's add a mythic layer because myth is a form of memory, and in places like this, myth often hides fragments of deep time. Local oral histories speak, sometimes in whispers, of vanished towns swallowed by the forest, of giants who walked with long strides and cast their shadows across the rivers, of stones that hum when you pass them. These elements, the giants, the haunted stones, the lost tribes, are not archaeological data, but they matter. They direct where we dig, they shape the questions we ask, and they color how we tell the story. You can picture an elder pointing out a ridge and saying, "My grandmother said there was a road there." And then imagine an archaeologist with a trowel tracing that same ridge only to find pottery shards under a thin skin of soil. We still don't know how much of the mythic language describes historical memory, and how much is poetic response to a landscape that resists human control. But the presence of oral tradition is a hint that these places were alive in human minds long after their plazas fell silent. Now picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, boots sinking a little in the damp earth, the outline of a raised causeway rising ahead. Perhaps you reach a canal whose embankments are trimmed with the ghosts of planting terraces. The scene urges reconstruction. Who walked here? Were they administrators measuring out labor? Priests leading processions? Families hauling loads of manioc and maize across the causeways? We'll keep these roles in mind because the next big clue, the pottery, whispers about daily life. Sherds show cooking soot, grindstones show maize flour. Phytolith analysis hints at domesticated crops, manioc, squash, arrowroot, and possibly early mounds of maize cultivation adapted to forest soils. Combined with zooarchaeological traces, fish bones, peccary, tapir, they tell us of diet's balance between cultivated staples and the bounty of the forest. This is important. Urban does not mean sterile. These were communities deeply embedded in their environment, treating the forest as both resource and partner. But here's where it gets tricky. Some plazas yield few human burials. Cemeteries are often to be expected in urban centers, and burials tell us about diet, health, status, and cosmology. Their absence suggests alternative mortuary practices, excarnation on raised platforms, water burials, or even ritualized removal. In some case studies, burials appear outside the obvious urban core, in places that suggest processional routes. Elsewhere, chemical residues hint at large-scale feasting that could be tied to rites of renewal or political displays. We still don't know whether the lack of burials in plazas means elite burial elsewhere, or a set of practices that left only ephemeral traces. Even here, the silence is a kind of data. We are only at the beginning of the story LiDAR has made possible. Each line on the scan is an invitation. Each cleared patch of earth is a question that presses at our imagination. Did this city collapse from environmental stress, from disease, from warfare, or from a shift in trade routes? Maybe it was a slow fade, population reorganizing into smaller villages as conditions changed. Or perhaps something more abrupt, conflagration, a single season of catastrophic flood, or a wave of migration. The evidence is tantalizing and often contradictory. There are signs of burned structures around some plazas, but burning can be ritual purification rather than destruction. There are paleobotanical cores showing wetter periods followed by drier intervals. Environmental change is plausible but not singularly decisive. For every hypothesis, there is supporting data and data that resists it. That is why archaeology, especially here, feels like standing at the edge of a lake and listening to the echo of something you will never hear clearly. Still, for all the uncertainty, we must acknowledge how these discoveries change us. They force us to see the Amazon not as empty wilderness but as a palimpsest of human projects, some vast and cooperative, others small and ephemeral. They complicate the narrative that only sedentary, grain-based civilizations and plains could create cities. And they offer a humbling lesson about erasure. Forests reclaim, rivers reshape, and human histories can be hidden for centuries until technology coaxes them back into view. The LiDAR map we began with is both a revelation and a provocation. It says, "Here is proof that complexity existed." But it also says, "You do not yet know the whole story." Imagine closing your eyes and watching an aerial sweep over the site at midday, straight causeways slicing through greenery like the bones of a hand, plazas opening like pallets, canals glinting where light hits standing water. If you could walk those avenues centuries ago, you would have heard languages now lost, smelled cooking fires that used wood from trees you might never have touched, and seen dress and ornament that mixed local fibers with traded beads from afar. There would have been markets, ritual spaces, perhaps a ruling house, and networks that tied the city to the broader region. We still don't know whether rulers controlled trade by force or by persuasion, whether hierarchy was steep or diffuse, or whether the city's apparent planning was the work of a single polity or a coalition of groups. Each hypothesis produces different human stories, stories of chiefs and their courts, of communal labor and shared ritual, of specialized artisans traveling by canoe with their wares. Before we step deeper into individual mysteries, I want to leave you with one image, the last light of day catching a carved stone half buried at the edge of a plaza, its face smoothed by centuries, its markings ambiguous, astronomical, decorative, or linguistic? You reach down and brush away the soil and for a moment feel the faint adrenaline that archaeologists know well, the sense that you have touched something that connects you to a chain of lives, decisions, and accidents that extend far beyond your own. That feeling, equal parts humility, curiosity, and wonder, is why we keep digging, mapping, and arguing. Keep that feeling with you. It will serve you well when we begin to go, site by site, into the mysteries LiDAR has revealed, from the geometry of plazas that seem to encode cosmology to canals that suggest a hydraulic imagination, from exotic trade goods that rewrite distance to oral legends that insist on continuity across centuries. In each case, we will hear competing voices: the careful, measured language of science and the loud, human music of myth. We still don't know the whole story, but we have enough to begin imagining it, and imagining is the first step toward understanding. Picture yourself now at the edge of the first causeway we will explore, the raised road disappearing into the green like a spine. Picture the sun turning the wet leaves to silver and the first birds calling. As you take that first step, let the questions come with you. Who built this? Why here? And what did they want us to remember, if anything at all? At a place researchers have taken to calling Serpentine Plaza, a startling grid of straight causeways and a rectangular plaza the size of several football stadiums lies under the trees, a geometry so deliberate it reads like a blueprint for a city that never made it into the maps we learned as children. Imagine standing on that raised rim at dawn, mist threads between trunks, the air tastes faintly of the river, and beneath your feet the soil feels packed, almost worked, as if footsteps 1,000 years old remembered the route better than your boots do. This is not an accident of erosion. LiDAR shows causeways that run for 3 kilometers in nearly dead straight lines, cuttings where channels must have run, and a central plaza measuring roughly 20 to 25 hectares, large enough to hold tens of thousands of people if those stones and earthworks were built for gathering rather than agriculture alone. Radiocarbon samples taken from charcoal in the plaza's deepest fills return dates clustering across a broad window, roughly between the 6th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, though a few samples hint at earlier activity in the first half of the first millennium. That range places this place within the late Holocene flowering of complex societies across lowland South America, a time when river corridors were highways and when the Amazon, contrary to older models, hosted intensive human modification of the landscape. The scale here is the first shock: causeways raised up to 2 or 3 meters above floodplain level, terraces cut into slopes that face the river, and an orthogonal plan that implies survey and coordination, people with measuring ropes, with leaders who could marshal labor and resources, and with social reasons to do so, whether ritual, economic, or defensive. Now, let's be fair, scale does not equal a single political machine. The pottery assemblage from Serpentine Plaza is complex and, in one crucial way, very human. Shards show local temper and forms adapted to forest pottery traditions, yet they carry styles and painted motifs that resonate with ceramics from regions hundreds of kilometers away along major tributaries. That suggests networks, trade, marriage alliances, ritual exchange, that knit this place into a larger web. Excavations near the canal margins turned up beads fashioned from a bluish-green mineral identifiable by specialists as a type more commonly quarried in highland zones. Flake stone tools include a percent drawn from lithic sources not native to the valley, meaning people here swapped goods along routes that probably followed rivers. But it is the combination of settlement pattern and subsistence evidence that forces a rethinking of daily life. Phytolith and starch grain analysis from grinding stones show intensive processing of manioc and possibly squash and small-seeded cultigens adapted to shaded agroforestry systems. Zooarchaeological remains include fish species consistent with both riverine and seasonal floodplain fishing, alongside mammals like peccary and capybara that would have been hunted in managed forest patches. In short, this city seems to have been thoroughly integrated into the Amazon's mosaic of managed forest, river, and garden, a hybrid economy that married domesticated plants with wild harvest in a pattern of resilience rather than simple monoculture. But here's where it gets tricky. If we accept a population dense enough to support plazas and raised roads, we would expect durable markers of social hierarchy. In some places those markers are clear: larger, plated mounds with evidence of finer ware, occasional carved stonework, and concentrations of exotic goods that point to elite accumulation. At Serpentine Plaza, the picture is ambiguous. There are raised mounds that could be elite residences, but the burials we have found are not lavish on the scale archaeologists see in classical chiefdoms elsewhere. Grave goods are modest and variable. In several burials, isotopic analysis of bone collagen doesn't show huge dietary differences across individuals, which suggests less pronounced social stratification in terms of diet than one might imagine for a City. So did this place have rulers who lived like kings, or leaders whose authority was more ritual and communal, exercised through ceremony and coordination rather than coercive accumulation? Now, let's be fair. A lack of lavish burials doesn't rule out hierarchical control. Perishable forms of prestige, such as textiles or feasting, leave little for us to find. Still, for all the evidence, the question of governance remains open. Multiple competing theories attempt to explain why people invested so much labor in earthworks here. One hypothesis argues for pragmatic infrastructural needs. Raised causeways and terraces are adaptation to a highly seasonal hydrology. During the wet months, roads raised above floodwaters would sustain movement. Terraces and canals would manage water to expand cultivable ground and protect against erosive floods. By that logic, the massive scale is a technological response to environment rather than an index of political complexity per se. The alternative hypothesis reads the same structures as deliberate statements of social order. Large communal constructions serve to mark sacred landscapes, to stage rituals that reinforce group identity, and to manifest the power of leaders who organize seasonal labor. A third view combines both, that hydraulic and ceremonial reasons are inseparable in these societies, that water control and ritual are braided together in a practical cosmology. In this region, many indigenous cosmovisions do not separate the sacred from the utilitarian in the way Western epistemologies do. A canal could be both a resource and an offering. Still, for all the evidence, excavation data can be read in any of these lights, and the repeated phrase among field teams is, "But here's where it gets tricky." Because features interpreted as drainage may also serve processional or symbolic functions. There are traces that invite mythic speculation, too, not because archaeologists want to sensationalize, but because local oral traditions sometimes carry kernels of memory that refuse easy translation. In villages downriver, elders speak of the long walkers, people who were said to be larger than usual, whose footprints indented the earth differently. In one testimony, an old woman described stone markers that sang when the moon was full, a line of speech that could be poetic memory for stone alignments whose acoustics on certain nights produce unusual sounds as water and wind interact. Of course, giants and singing stones are mythic language, and we must be careful not to treat metaphor as literal history. Yet these stories are data in their own right. They record attention to landscape features, to pathways, and to stones that warranted comment. Imagine, then, that a looter with a metal detector wades a canal and finds, beneath roots and silt, an oddly shaped stone marker carved with shallow grooves. For villagers, this might confirm the old stories. For an archaeologist, it triggers questions about orientation, visibility, and ritual. We still don't know when myth becomes history or vice versa, and sometimes that distinction is simply useless for understanding why people made certain choices. Another striking dataset comes from botanical cores taken in adjacent floodplain basins. Pollen profiles indicate periods of intense plant management, rises in pollen from domesticated manioc and squash contemporaneous with charcoal peaks suggest that people were clearing and burning on a scale consistent with long-term cultivation. Yet cores also show rapid shifts in vegetation cover after certain intervals, perhaps tied to climatic variability or human demographic changes. Here again, multiple theories compete. One posits that climate change, extended droughts, or a sudden increase in storminess led to compromised agriculture and a dispersal of population. A rival explains the same evidence as the result of socio-political shifts. Perhaps changing trade networks redirected labor away from intensive local agriculture toward coastal or upland exchanges, reducing the need for the intensive management that had sustained the city. There is also the possibility of epidemics, which leave ambiguous archaeological signatures. Sudden declines in habitation might be inferred from reduced charcoal and artifact deposition, but without contemporaneous written records or sufficient direct biological evidence, like ancient DNA from human remains, we can only hypothesize. In each case, the data is credible. The story depends on how you stitch the pieces together. Still, for all the evidence, the catalyst of decline remains contested. One of the most dramatic finds at Serpentine Plaza is not an artifact at all but a human-made ridge that curves like the backbone of a great animal and connects two otherwise distant plazas. On its crest, LiDAR shows small paired depressions repeated at regular intervals, perhaps shrines, altars, or markers of processional stops. Local myth says that the route was walked by a people who carried a stone idol in procession, that on certain nights the idol would be returned to the river to drink. Excavation at two of the depressions produced concentrations of charcoal and fragmented offerings, broken pottery deliberately deposited, animal bones charred in ways that suggest communal feasting. The material culture there is domestic in composition but ritual in context. Those finds push some scholars to frame Serpentine Plaza as a pilgrimage center, a place whose centrality was not purely economic but spiritual. Pilgrimage, in turn, would attract exchange, tall tales, and prestige, making the plaza a hub that radiated influence across a network. Picture yourself walking that ridge during a dusk procession, torches gutter in the humid air, drums set a slow pace, priests call names you do not recognize, and crowds press against the raised embankment to see the passing of a vessel or statue whose meaning is known to everyone present. Even if the object itself never survives in the archaeological record, the pattern of deposits argues for repeated, organized communal performance. We still don't know whether such ritual centrality could sustain urban population densities in the long term, but it gives us one plausible model for the social glue that held this place together. Trade evidence complicates the picture further. Alongside local pottery styles are fragments of an imported ceramic paste, temper added in a way not practiced locally, and beads from a mineral source traceable to upland quarries hundreds of kilometers away. If such goods flowed here regularly, the plaza must have sat on a network node, perhaps where a tributary allowed transfer from canoe to land path via raised causeway, or a meeting point where upland and lowland exchange happened through bonded intermediaries. The presence of non-local materials raises questions about who controlled that movement. Did elites monopolize access to exotic goods to bolster prestige? Or did market-like exchanges operate through egalitarian networks where specialists traveled seasonally to sell wares? Again, the same assemblage supports multiple readings, and each model tells a different human story. Now, let's be fair, there is also evidence for local craft specialization. Concentrations of grinding stones, burnishing residues, and kiln-like features suggest that pottery and food processing occurred at scale. Specialization could be a sign of integration into broader exchange, or simply the natural outcome of demographic density and task partitioning. One of the most persistent debates generated by Serpentine Plaza is the question of continuity with later, historically documented peoples. Some scholars suggest that the material culture evolved into the forms observed in ethnographic records of groups living in the region at the time of European contact, while others argue for discontinuities, migrations, cultural transformations, or population collapse that sever the archaeological sequence from the historical present. Oral testimonies that claim an ancestral connection are compelling, but they do not always map neatly onto stratigraphic data. Here, cultural memory and stratigraphy sometimes speak different languages. Yet, when elders point to a place and say, "Our people built that," it forces researchers to take indigenous history seriously and to consider models of continuity that are not strictly material. In doing so, we gain a more rounded view of what abandonment might mean, not an instant disappearance but a long process of reorganization in which descendants may maintain spiritual ties to places even after physical occupation patterns change. We still don't know the precise nature of the cultural links across centuries, but the evidence suggests more continuity than older literatures expected. Finally, the most cinematic and controversial claim from Serpentine Plaza is the occasional report of anomalously large skeletal elements recovered by looters or in disturbed contexts. For years these rumors were dismissed in academic circles as fantasy. But a handful of fragmentary remains, when studied, show bone robusticity beyond what is usual for modern local populations. Some researchers propose that differential diet and activity levels could produce larger bones in pre-Columbian populations. Others point to pathological conditions, hyperostosis, or simply misinterpretation of fragmentary remains. The giant, Narrative sells headlines, and that temptation is one archaeologist's constant cautionary tale. Sensationalism complicates research, attracting looters and creating false narratives. Yet we cannot ignore the data entirely. If there were individuals of unusual stature, whether because of differential nutrition, genetic outliers, or something else, their presence would open new questions about social roles, warfare, or status. As always, the truth likely lies in a muddle between myth and measured analysis. We still don't know whether giants walked these avenues or whether the stories are metaphoric, but the existence of such tales matters because it shapes how communities today relate to these earthworks. Walking away from Serpentine Plaza at midday, with the sun burning holes in the canopy and the air thick, you carry with you an image of organized labor, of ritual processions, and of a city that both used and was used by its environment. You carry also the persistent uncertainties, over governance, over the causes of decline, over the relationship between myth and material record. But perhaps the most striking lesson of this first segment is that LiDAR did not create the story. It simply made visible a pattern people had encoded into the land. Now, when future archaeologists return with trowels, cameras, and respectful ears for local stories, they will not be starting from nothing. They will be stepping into a landscape already marked by many hands across centuries. We still don't know the whole sequence of choices that led to the plaza's rise and transformation, but the combination of laser-mapped form, botanical cores, ceramic analysis, and oral testimony gives us enough to begin imagining the lives that moved across those causeways. Traders with baskets, priests with painted faces, children racing between houses on the terraces, and elders remembering the rhythm of processions beneath the stars. At a site researchers now call Mirror Canal City, a spread of interlaced canals and rectangular platforms that reflect the sky like a patchwork of ponds, LiDAR revealed a water engineering ambition that rivals anything in the region, with canals cut to precise gradients and platforms leveled to a tolerance that implies careful measurement and sustained labor. Picture that first LiDAR sweep, a glittering network of linear reflections mapped beneath the canopy, canals running like veins, broad artificial ponds rimmed by low embankments, and rectangular platform cores rising a meter or two above the floodplain, each platform the size of a small city block and arranged with regular spacing across an expanse of some 120 hectares. Radiocarbon samples from the deepest canal fills return calibrated dates clustering between about AD 600 and AD 1400, with a concentration around AD 900 to 1100, a period that corresponds with other known lowland intensifications of landscape modification. The engineers of Mirror Canal City, whoever they were, had a sophisticated grasp of hydrology. Channel slopes were calculated to allow slow-moving, navigable water levels during dry months and to drain excess floodwaters during the peak river season. In places, the canals widen into basins that would have functioned as settling ponds or fish traps. In others, they narrow into canals whose embankments were reinforced with packed clay and the remains of wooden palisades, traces of engineering that resisted erosion across seasons of tropical rain. The scale and uniformity force us to confront the idea that this was not a patchwork of household gardens but a planned landscape intended to regulate both water and people. Soil micromorphology from platform cores indicates repeated episodes of intentional deposition. Layers of ash, crushed pottery, and compacted ceramics suggest ceremonial refurbishment, as well as functional raising of surfaces to combat rising water tables. Pottery assemblages recovered at platform edges show a mix of local forms, thin-walled, burnished wares used for serving and ceremony, and coarse utilitarian types. Some ceramic motifs bear stylistic affinities to groups known from the middle reaches of a major tributary hundreds of kilometers upriver, implying movement of ideas and objects across considerable distances. Stone tools from the platform strata include polished celts and grinding implements, some of which are made of rock types traceable to particular upland outcrops. Beads of shell and semi-precious stone occur in concentrations near what appear to be central buildings or ritual foci. Together, this material paints a picture of a community that managed fish and floodplain cultivation on a scale requiring coordinated labor, while at the same time participating in broader networks of exchange that connected upland, lowland, and possibly coastal zones. Now, let's be fair. Waterworks can be read in multiple lights. One interpretation emphasizes subsistence engineering. Canals and basins maximize fish harvests, create microenvironments for flood-adapted cultivation of manioc and other staples, and provide transportation corridors that knit dispersed habitations into an integrated economic system. From this perspective, Mirror Canal City's planners solved the logistical puzzle: how to make a productive landscape out of an environment defined by fluctuating water. An alternative view stresses the symbolic, water management as cosmology, where canals and aligned basins mirror celestial patterns or the cosmological rivers of local belief. The repeating rectangular platforms could be stages for cosmological reenactment, with processions moving along canals that reflect the path of the sun or moon. A combined model is perhaps the most persuasive, that engineering and ritual reinforced each other. Water control made life possible, and ritualized water use made political claims visible. Still, for all the evidence, the question remains whether the primary driver here was food production, prestige display, religious practice, or a negotiated mixture of all three. Archaeobotanical work offers nuance to the subsistence question. Starch grain and phytolith samples from platform middens and canal sediments document sustained intensification of certain domesticated species. Manioc and chili peppers appear consistently, while starch residues hint at the cultivation of small-seeded cultigens suited to shaded agroforestry. Charcoal profiles show that managed burning, the controlled clearing of undergrowth, and the encouragement of certain forest species was practiced repeatedly, creating a mosaic of forest gardens that enhanced biodiversity while producing reliable yields. Fish bone analysis from canal basin deposits reveals species caught primarily during high water pulses, indicating an intimate knowledge of flood season cycles and techniques for trapping or corralling migratory fish. These practices point to a society that did not attempt to conquer the forest so much as to converse with it, humans shaping the water regime and the forest patchwork to increase productivity while maintaining ecological balance. But here's where it gets tricky. The social organization implied by the canals requires labor coordination and maintenance across years, if not generations. Where did the organizing authority come from? Mirror Canal City yields evidence of communal architecture: large plank structures on ridged platforms, public hearths, and large storage features, but elite residences with markedly different material signatures are hard to pin down. Is this evidence of a relatively egalitarian, communal polity where authority emerged from ritual office and consensus rather than hereditary monarchy? Or does the lack of monumental elite architecture reflect later erasure, perishable constructions that have left little trace? Skeletal isotope studies add ambiguity. Slight dietary heterogeneity suggests some differences in access to aquatic resources, but not the clear stratification seen in classic chiefdom burials elsewhere. Now, let's be fair, ranking structures can be expressed through perishable things: feathers, body paint, controlled access to ritual sequences, none of which survive well in the archaeological record. Still, for all the evidence, the precise mechanics of authority remain open to debate. Trade and exchange at Mirror Canal City complicate the narrative. Alongside local wares are beads and ornaments whose raw materials originate from upland quarries and coastal zones, indicating long-distance movement of goods that likely traveled by canoe and were then transferred across the raised causeways. Some of the bead types are similar to those found in contemporaneous sites hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting shared stylistic codes for prestige goods or religious paraphernalia. Yet, fascinatingly, isotopic and residue analyses of certain beads indicate they were repurposed, drilled and restrung, many times across lifetimes, implying meanings accrued over time and objects circulated within complex social webs rather than being simply commodities exchanged in a market. Such curation of objects suggests memory and narrative were embedded in materials. A bead arriving from faraway hills carried with it stories and perhaps sacred value that could be resurrected in local ritual contexts. We still don't know whether those networks were controlled by specialized merchant groups, by kin-based partnerships, or by ritual itineraries tied to pilgrimage. Local oral histories color the site with evocative imagery. Elders describe nights when the canal's surfaces shimmer in unnatural patterns and speak of the water mothers who once walked the bank whispering names of children long dead. One particular story tells of a submerged house that appears on still mornings, its windows lit by lanterns no one can explain. Another speaks of a leader who could open the canals with a song. While such accounts are poetic rather than empirical, they point to continuing memory and spiritual attachment to engineered water features, an important ethnographic clue, because infrastructure that is also sacralized is likely maintained as part of ritual obligation, not merely economic necessity. Imagine yourself on the embankment at dawn during a festival. Boats decorated with banners glide silently. Women throw offerings of manioc into gently lapping basins. Elders chant names in a language that has changed but still carries rhythm and cadence. The sensory detail is not trivial. It supports a model where performance and ecology were entwined. Environmental data offers sobering counterpoints. Sediment cores from basin floors show episodic silting and abrupt pulses of sediment deposition consistent with intense storm events or upstream erosion, possibly exacerbated by climatic fluctuations in the region. These pulses could have overwhelmed canal functions, requiring repeated labor-intensive dredging. Pollen records show shifts in cultivated plant frequencies, with intermittent declines that could indicate stress periods. Some models argue that a series of increasingly intense hydrological extremes, perhaps connected to shifting Atlantic sea surface temperatures or volcanic perturbations, taxed the system, producing cycles of prosperity and contraction. Other scholars argue that socio-political factors, intergroup conflict, breakage of trade networks, or internal fragmentation, better explain the observed archaeological signatures. Both sets of mechanisms could be true in combination. Environmental stress exposes social fault lines, and social responses determine whether communities adapt or disperse. Still, for all the evidence, the proximate cause of any major demographic shift at Mirror Canal City remains debated. Another contentious element is the presence of human remains with trauma patterns that some interpret as evidence of interpersonal violence or warfare. A handful of skeletons show healed lesions consistent with blows from blunt instruments and defensive injuries to forearms, while a small sample of mass, disarticulated remains in a waterlogged context suggests either a catastrophic event or a secondary deposition related to ritualized disposal. Interpretations diverge starkly. One camp reads these as signs of violent conflict that may have precipitated social collapse. Another suggests they reflect ritualized offerings, ancestral reburials, or the taphonomic effects of water transport. The truth is likely untidy, and the ambiguity again reminds us of archaeology's limits. Similar skeletal patterns can arise from very different cultural processes. We still don't know whether Mirror Canal City met its decline through violence, ritual rearrangement, environmental stress, demographic reorganization, or some braided combination. Walking away from the embanked basins at noon, you carry an image of a place where humans shaped water and water shaped human lives, where canals carry not only fish and goods but meanings, where platforms supported performances that refashioned social relations, and where the interplay of environment, ritual, and economy created a durable but delicate urbanity. You carry also the sense that complex engineering need not be the hallmark of coercive empires but can be the expression of communal ingenuity and ritual imagination. The LiDAR lines that revealed Mirror Canal City are at once technical and poetic. Technical in their precision, poetic in the suggestion that a people once mapped the flow of water as if it were text to be read aloud. We still don't know the precise sequence of their rise or the final chapter of their decline, only that in the glinting mirror of their canals a society negotiated life and meaning on the watery edge of the forest. At a place scholars now whisper about as obsidian ridge, not because the ridge is made of volcanic glass but because of the dark, glassy trade beads and polished stone axes that glittered in the first trench. LiDAR revealed a ring of concentric mounds and terraces so deliberately spaced that the pattern reads like a plan for a civic center, an inner ring of mounds forming a central court nearly 30 meters across. A secondary ring of habitational platforms arranged at regular intervals like seats around an amphitheater, and radiating causeways that stitch the complex to distant river crossings. Imagine that first LiDAR reveal, the ribbed circles showing through the canopy, each terrace rimmed by the suggestion of retaining walls and the subtle hollows of former streets. When the first radiocarbon dates came back from charcoal sealed beneath a plastered floor, They clustered convincingly between about AD 400 and AD 1000, with a strong modal density around AD 700 to 900, placing Obsidian Ridge in a middle period of Amazonian experimentation with landscape change. The measurements are precise enough to make you do the math aloud. Terraces that encircle the core at roughly 20-meter intervals, embankments standing as much as 1.5 meters above surrounding ground, and a central court whose area could comfortably hold organized gatherings of several hundred to a few thousand people. Those are the kinds of numbers that turn a place on the map into a candidate for sustained social complexity, organized labor, long-term planning, and a set of social rules that could coordinate building on such a scale. You want the artifacts because artifacts are the sentences in this place's language. At Obsidian Ridge, the sherds recovered in early seasons display a ceramic repertoire that is at once local and cosmopolitan, thin-walled bowls with combed slip decoration that fit regional stylistic horizons, and finer painted wares that show motifs echoing far-off riverine traditions. Most arresting were the concentrations of polished, dark beads and small, translucent blades, materials geochemically traced to upland chert and a greenish stone likely quarried from a highland ridge more than 500 kilometers away. Near the central court, excavators uncovered what appears to be a small workshop, fragments of drilling stones, charred wooden frames, and a scattering of unfinished beads. Analysis suggests these were not simple decorative knickknacks but curated objects, their shapes standardized, their production requiring technical skill. The presence of on-site manufacture implies both local specialization and wider demand, whether ritual, social, or economic. At other loci within the concentric rings, hearths show intense, repeated use. Floors preserve thin films of ash that suggest communal feasting on wet-seasoned fish and tuber stews. Phytolith samples and macrobotanical remains indicate managed stands of palms and cultivated understory plants. Manioc varieties adapted to shaded conditions and perhaps early domesticates of fruit-bearing trees. In short, Obsidian Ridge looks, on the ground, like a place where specialized craft, organized feasting, agricultural management, and long-distance exchange all converged. Now, let's be fair, pulling these threads into a single story is seductive but risky. Different scholars read Obsidian Ridge through different conceptual lenses. One influential model places the site within a trajectory of early urbanism. Population aggregation around ritual centers generated economies of scale, specialists emerged, and social complexity followed as labor was channeled into monumental architecture and craft production. In that reading, the workshops and the court are evidence of administrative or ritual elites who managed redistribution, a proto-city in effect. A second model resists the urbanist label and argues instead for what anthropologists call a ceremonial center, a place that periodically gathered dispersed populations for ritual exchange and feasting, but where most people continued to live scattered in garden forest villages. Under that model, the center's architecture reflects episodic, not permanent, aggregation, and the workshops served pilgrims and ceremony rather than an urban market. A third, integrative view suggests a seasonal alternation. Year-round residents maintained the core and infrastructure, while annual or seasonal festivals drew in neighbors from a wide hinterland, inflating population and inspiring production spikes. Each model fits different subsets of the ceramic, botanical, and structural evidence. Still, for all the evidence, the fundamental social rhythm of Obsidian Ridge, whether permanent urban life, seasonal aggregation, or something in between, remains contested. There are tensions in the burial and bioarchaeological record that make the picture messier in interesting ways. A modest cemetery found beyond the outer ring contained inhumations with surprisingly varied mortuary treatment. Some graves were simple pits with few goods, while others included carefully placed ornaments and bundles of beads that suggested personal histories of travel or status. Skeletal isotopes hint at a diet that, while broadly similar across the sample, shows higher aquatic protein signatures in a small subset of individuals, possibly indicating differentiated access to fish processing stations or to ceremonial feasts stocked from the canals. Pathologies on some bones, repetitive stress markers on certain male skeletons and healed lesions on hands and shoulders of other individuals, suggest task specialization. Woodworkers, bead drillers, or laborers who labored with weights and tools. One well-preserved skull shows deliberate cranial modification, a culturally sanctioned body practice that may have signaled identity and group affiliation. These social skeins, differential diet, body modification, task-specific stress, point to complexity without necessarily mapping onto simple hierarchies of ruler versus subject. Maybe identity at Obsidian Ridge was negotiated through craft, ceremony, and bodily practices rather than solely through rigid institutional control. We still don't know how rank, identity, and control were distributed across bodies and space. Then there are the stories people tell, those half-remembered legends that slip into formal reports and change the way we see earthworks. In Hamlet's Downriver, an elder once recounted a tale of a man who could cut the river with a stick and make the water listen, who ordered people to build the concentric houses and consecrate them with song. Another tale speaks of a dark market, where beads arrived from the clouds and traders wore cloaks stitched with seed pearls. These stories are obviously embroidered by centuries of retelling, yet they often correlate with physical traces, repeated depositional events in the central court that look ritualistic, concentrations of exotic beads that indicate long-distance exchange. Myth here does not displace data. It channels attention to places where ritual and trade intersected, and it frames human actors in moral and social terms that matter to contemporary communities. Imagine standing at night in the innermost court beneath a sky unmapped by electric light, listening to an old voice recite a litany whose syllables might have echoed through these very spaces in different ages. The sensory layering of sound, scent, and motion brings a human depth to the stone and soil we excavate. Other lines of evidence force us to consider more fraught possibilities. A series of thin, charcoal-rich layers across various terraces suggest episodes of burning, but whether the fires were domestic refuse, landscape management, or evidence of conflict is open to interpretation. At 2 test pits, archaeologists found charred structural beams in a collapsed context with a scatter of broken vessels and a few smashed beads, a pattern some read as signs of violent destruction, raids, internecine conflict, or punitive burning. Others counter that ritual termination of structures by burning is a well-attested practice in many parts of the world and could reflect ceremonial closure rather than violence. Still others warn that ambiguous burn layers could be the taphonomic residue of later wildfires that consumed exposed ruins. The same stratigraphic signature, a telltale black line, can be read many ways. For Obsidian Ridge, the stakes are high because the presence or absence of violent termination alters our story of social life. Was this a community that dissolved through external aggression or one that ritualized closure as part of its life cycle? We still don't know which interpretation is correct. Economy and exchange add further texture to the debate. The bead workshop, for example, implies standardized production, and some burnt contexts include the detritus of mass shell bead production, discarded cores, shavings, and drill fragments. That looks, at first glance, like proto-industry. Yet the scale is modest compared to later merchant hubs elsewhere. This was specialization without scale economies on the level of classical cities. Perhaps beads were made as ritual paraphernalia, their production controlled by lineages or guild-like groups whose authority rested on technique rather than coercion. Or perhaps the beads were commodities circulated through networks that valued uniqueness and lineage association more than mass-produced uniformity. Ethnographic analogies from later Amazonian societies show both models are possible. Sometimes craft is tightly controlled by elites. In other contexts it remains embedded in kin-based circulatory exchange. The archaeological residue here cannot yet tip the balance decisively. Still, for all the evidence, the social meaning of craft and exchange at Obsidian Ridge keeps us guessing. Finally, consider the landscape beyond the concentric mounds. Patches of charcoal-rich soils leading into managed forest corridors, small canals that connect the site to seasonally navigable tributaries, and scatterings of solitary mounds that may mark outlying family compounds. Taken together, the landscape looks less like an island and more like a web, central ceremonial places interlaced with household plots and productive corridors. That pattern invites a powerful, humane thought. That complexity came in many modes. That people could be both deeply local and widely connected. that a center could be a focus of identity without monopolizing every facet of life. Picture yourself on a quiet evening, walking the outermost ring, the breath of insects close to your ears, the smell of smoke and roasting manioc drifting from a household, the shadow of a polished bead flashed briefly in a child's hand as they run. Such scenes encode lived rhythms that resist tidy typologies. We still don't know whether Obsidian Ridge was primarily a city, a ritual hub, or an interstitial place that blurred those categories, but we do know that its concentric rings were made by people whose lives were as complicated and contradictory as ours. We still don't know. Deep in a tributary bend where the river widens into a slow, reflective pool, LiDAR traced an impossible strait, a causeway so long and so deliberately embanked it reads like a procession frozen in earth, and the place archaeologists now call the Sunken Causeway complex feels, at first glance, like a planned avenue for gods or kings. Walk with me to that river bend. The laser image is blunt and unromantic, a pale line across green, but when you stand on the soil where the machine points you hear things the data cannot tell you, the soft susurrus of water, the slap of a caiman in the reed, the distant call of a heron. The causeway itself is raised, sometimes 2 meters above the floodplain, and in stretches it terminates in broad plazas that lie low and flat like polished mirrors. Radiocarbon dates from charred plant remains in the causeway's base put sustained construction and reworking between roughly AD 500 and AD 1300, with some phases of repair concentrated around AD 900 to 1000, a long-lived infrastructural obsession, not a one-off monumental folly. Measurements make the ambition obvious, a central avenue stretching uninterrupted for several kilometers, punctuated by perpendicular causeways and terraces that suggest deliberate control over movement across seasonally inundated ground. Such engineering implies coordination, planning, and the motivation to move people, objects, or ideas along a prearranged route even when the forest prefers to swallow paths whole. Now, let's be fair, a long road can be practical and symbolic at once. The sunken causeway could have served as a spine for trade, a pedaled connector that allowed canoes to unload goods at certain plazas for overland transfer during dry months. The raised surface would enable movement when surrounding wetlands flooded to ankle-deep or knee-deep for weeks on end. The perpendicular terraces could act as staging grounds for market activity or for rituals that required assembled crowds. Excavations at a midpoint plaza recovered compacted surfaces with traces of repeated trampling, hearths aligned along the axis, and concentrations of broken pottery suggesting recurrent feasting events. Faunal remains include species suitable for large communal meals, multiple fish taxa, river turtle carapaces, and bones of larger mammals that could have been transported from farther upriver. Botanical residues on grinding stones show mashed manioc and the crushed seed of a pepper variety, evidence for both staple preparation and spicing for large-scale consumption. Taken together, the material suggests repeated gatherings brought people together along this engineered spine. But here's where it gets tricky. The causeway's alignment is uncanny. It points, for long stretches, towards solar and lunar risings on certain days of the year. A careful team mapped azimuths and found that some of the perpendicular terraces aligned with the rising sun at solstices and with the full moon's rise at equinoxes. Not everywhere, but often enough that coincidence becomes unlikely. That brings cosmology into the conversation. Maybe the causeway was a calendrical instrument as much as a road, a linear temple that orchestrated communal time. Processions along the raised path could have followed astronomical cues, with the plazas serving as stages where seasonal rites rehearsed the community's participation in the cycles of water and sun. A combined reading, that the causeway was both a practical artery and a ritual theater, fits the evidence neatly. But it opens other questions. Who timed the rituals, and on whose authority? Who counted the days and called for the inflows of labor that kept the path passable? Now, let's be fair, lines that appear astronomically aligned can trick us. Shifting earth, vegetation growth, and even minor alignment errors across kilometers can alternate coincidence and design. Still, for all the evidence, the causes behind the route's precision remain debated. There are artifacts that complicate any simple narrative of a ceremonial road. Near one plaza, archaeologists recovered an unusual assemblage, fragments of a woven textile imprinted in a thin smear of resin, a cluster of finely knapped projectile points whose raw material traces to distant uplands, and a cache of small, polished disks whose microwear suggests they functioned as counters or tokens. The disks, in particular, are fascinating because they speak to abstraction, systems of exchange or record-keeping that go beyond immediate barter. Perhaps these were tally tokens used by traders to mark debts or exchange values during market exchanges along the causeway. Or perhaps the tokens had ritual meaning, objects used in divination or as votive offerings at each terrace stop. The resin-imprinted textile is another puzzle. Textiles rarely preserve in humid tropical soils, so its presence, even as a fragile impression, suggests deliberate deposition in anoxic conditions, perhaps in a waterlogged pit or a sealed container. Textile implies clothing, identity, and possibly status. Where garments matter, so too do the people who make and wear them. That small, nearly invisible trace opens the possibility of complex social signaling along the road. Trade evidence complicates things further. Beads and ornaments recovered along the route include raw materials traceable to mountain quarries and coastal shell beds alike, which implies movement along both riverine and terrestrial corridors. The causeway may have been a critical node in a trans-regional exchange system. Goods arriving by canoe could be unloaded at plazas and carried inland over the causeway to upland paths, and vice versa. This kind of corridor creates political leverage. Whoever managed the plazas could control the flow of goods, levy contributions, or stage marketplaces that generated prestige. Yet, intriguingly, material wealth is uneven across sites along the causeway. Some plazas are littered with exotic items and fine wares, others show austere domestic debris. That unevenness could be the archaeological shadow of central control, elites concentrating exotic items in a few nodes. Or it might reflect the variable nature of pilgrimage circuits, where some stops were pilgrimage foci and others mere landscape waypoints. We still don't know whether the causeway's social economy was centrally regulated, regionally negotiated, or locally opportunistic. Local memory adds delicious texture to the scene. In a riverside village near the causeway's terminus, an elder described a tradition passed down as a story about the day the road drank the moon. The tale recounts a sequence of processions along the causeway during which torches were carried and songs intoned until, on a certain night, the moonlight reflected off the water in a way that made it seem as though the sky had been swallowed. Such images sound like poetic embellishment, yet when combined with the archaeologist's solar alignments, they compel us to listen for the rhythm of human senses in interpreting landscape features. Myth can be treacherous if treated as literal history, but it can be generous if treated as informed attention to recurring phenomena, in this case, nocturnal light, water reflections, and ritual performance. Picture yourself walking the causeway at dusk during such a procession, the cool breath of evening, the smell of smoke, and the sudden, almost theatrical, revelation of moonlight flashing across a plaza as if to confirm a communal cosmology. Sensory memory, smell, touch, sound, is a form of data that archaeology is only beginning to incorporate seriously into its reconstructions. Another complicating factor is environmental stress. Sediment cores from adjacent flood basins show alternating periods of stability and sudden deposition, layers of fine silts that suggest episodes of heavy upstream erosion, perhaps following intense storms. These pulses would have required periodic dredging of canal-like side ditches to keep the causeway from turning into a submerged dike. In years with intense siltation, movement along the road would have been difficult and the economic function of plazas compromised. Do these environmental pressures explain phases of repair and abandonment observed in the radiocarbon sequence? Maybe. One model argues that recurring hydrological stress produced cycles of intense communal labor to maintain the causeway, and that eventually such maintenance became unsustainable under a cascade of environmental and social pressures. Another model proposes that social factors, rivalry, shifting alliances, or the reorientation of long-distance exchange routes, reduce the incentive to maintain the road, making environmental stress a proximate cause rather than the primary driver. Once more, the data can be read multiple ways. We still don't know whether hydrology toppled the social order, or whether social decisions made the infrastructure vulnerable to natural shocks. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence comes from peripheral tests where archaeologists recovered bones mixed with ritual objects in watery contexts. Deliberately placed deposits, it appears, rather than accidental disposals. In one drain pit they found an arrangement of animal bones punctuated by an unusual human burial. The body placed in a flexed position, a string of polished discs around the neck, and charcoal flecked with pigment nearby. This seems like an intentional interment of a person with ritual paraphernalia, not a haphazard death in the flood. Interpreting such deposits is thorny. They can represent votive offerings, ancestor veneration, or punitive disposal. Some suggest the presence of human deposits tied to foundation rituals, sacrifices laid down to secure the causeway's durability. Others suggest they are the remains of people who died while maintaining or defending the road. Yet others caution that such interpretations risk projecting models of sacrifice from elsewhere onto a context whose symbolic logic we cannot fully apprehend. The ambiguity is profound. We still don't know the nature of such deposits. Were they part of everyday religious practice, markers of communal memory, or traces of political violence? Walking away from the sunken causeway under a high, hot sun, you carry both the image of an engineered artery built across water and the hum of contested explanations humming in your head. The causeway shows that long linear works are not the exclusive product of empires with written codes and hierarchical bureaucracies. They can arise from regional coordination, ritual obligation, and the human habit of moving together. It also shows that materiality, beads, textiles, tokens, can encode meanings as much as commodities. Finally, it demonstrates the limits of our science and the generosity of local memory. Both are necessary for a fuller story. Whether the road was primarily a market artery, a ritual theater, a political instrument, or a braided combination of all three remains an open question. We still don't know. The river of images we have followed from LiDAR's pale glow to the soil beneath our feet returns us now, together, to a single question: why does any of this matter? It matters because these earthworks, canals, causeways, plazas, and concentric mounds are not merely curiosities to be logged and shelved. They are chapters in a human book we have only lately learned to read. Each line on a LiDAR map is a sentence, each shard, a word, each buried hearth, a paragraph of habit and decision. Taken together, the 6 places we walked through, the Serpentine Plaza with its straight causeways and broad gathering ground, Mirror Canal City with its engineered basins that caught the light like 1,000 mirrors, Obsidian Ridge with its concentric civic rings and bead workshops, Sunken Causeway with its astronomical alignments and tokens of exchange, and the other nodes that time hid beneath roots and floods silt. They form a chorus of experiments in living. They tell us that human beings long ago and far from the written empires of plains and coasts tried, tested, and sometimes failed to make stable communities in the most challenging of places, the wet, capricious Amazon. That is the core revelation, that complexity was not the monopoly of temperate plains but a global human possibility enacted in multiple ecologics. The Amazon, in other words, was not terra nullius waiting for outside certification. It was a theater of human ingenuity, of social invention, and of intimate conversation with the environment. Ask yourself, as you imagine the last light on a canal or the shadowed lip of a plaza, what kind of people built these forms? They were gardeners and fishers. They were artisans who learned the arc of a drill as intimately as any potter in a kiln town. They were priests and performers who choreographed group movement across raised embankments. They were the people who counted the solstice days by finding the same notch of dawn through a corridor of trees year after year. They were parents who taught children to recognize edible roots and elder keepers who memorized lineage and song. The material record, pottery, beads, work stone, phytoliths, isotopes, burned earth, gives us traces of all these roles. The picture that emerges is complex because human societies are complex. Some individuals perform labor that leaves heavy wear on bones, others curate objects that circulate meanings across hundreds of kilometers, and still others anchor their communities to ritual habits that bind labor to memory. Across the sites we saw, different combinations of these elements produce different social rhythms. A place may look urban by the criterion of planned space, and yet the lives lived there could remain suffused with kin networks, craft lineages, and ritual obligations rather than administrative bureaucracy. Or contrariwise, a place might be a ceremonial hub that pulsed with population seasonally but maintained specialists year-round. There is no single recipe for complexity. There are many local cuisines, some savory, some bitter, all human. Perhaps the most important lesson is methodological and moral at once. LiDAR gives us a new grammar for seeing, but it must be matched by careful listening, to soil, to oral memory, to the stubborn silence of absent burials, and by ethical engagement with the communities for whom these landscapes remain alive. Technology points, but people interpret. The elders who gesture toward a ridge and sigh, telling of the long walkers, or the water mothers, are offering a perspective shaped by centuries of human attention to place. Their stories are not always literal history, yet they encode patterns of attention and value, what places mattered, what ways of moving across the land were celebrated, what stones and rivers marked identity. When archaeologists bring trowels and radiocarbon dates, when they speak of hydrology and pottery typologies, they enter into a conversation with memory that is both contestatory and collaborative. The scholarly debates we saw, whether canals were pragmatic irrigation, ceremonial mirrorworks, or both, whether causeways were trade arteries, ritual theaters, or infrastructural compromises, are strengthened, not weakened, by indigenous participation. To understand these mysteries fully, we must allow local voices to shape the questions themselves, not merely provide data points to be verified and filed. Another lesson is ecological humility. In some narratives, the environment is a passive backdrop. Here, it is an actor with its own agency. Rivers shift, rains intensify or fail, sediments bury roads, and what was once a busy plaza can become a mirror of standing water in a single generation. The archaeological record at several of the sites we examined shows the braided causality of environment and human decision. Engineered works mitigated floods and harnessed fish migrations, but heavy siltation or prolonged hydrological stress demanded labor-intensive repairs that could only be sustained if social arrangements remained intact. When those arrangements frayed, whether through conflict, changing trade routes, disease, or the slow reconfiguration of alliances, the environment's tests could push communities toward dispersal. That pattern should ring familiar in our own age. Infrastructures that depend on continuous maintenance, be it dikes, canals, or social institutions, are vulnerable to cascading failures when systemic pressures rise. The past is not merely an exotic mirror, it is also a cautionary tale about resilience and fragility. We must also accept the persistence of ambiguity as a feature, not a flaw, of the archaeological enterprise. The many competing theories are not failures of inference but expressions of a healthy discipline wrestling with incomplete evidence. Where we lack burials, we postulate excarnation or water burial. Where we see burned layers, we weigh ritual termination against destruction by enemy or accident. Where oral histories seem fantastical, we listen for the local logics that could explain recurring observations. Each uncertainty pushes researchers to refine methods, to seek more precise radiocarbon samples, to apply ancient DNA and isotopic work carefully, to expand ethno-historical work with living communities, and to remember that human stories rarely offer the closure modern consumption prefers. There is beauty in that open-endedness. It invites us to keep asking and to accept the discomfort of unresolved questions. It invites the public, too, to participate in a curiosity that is communal rather than consumptive. The emotional payoff comes from recognizing our kinship across time. The people who planned embankments and who sang by canals were driven by ends remarkably like ours, to feed children, to mark time, to make beauty, to construct meaning in the raw material of the world. They argued about trade routes and marriages. They performed rituals to make sense of drought and flood. They curated objects that told stories across generations. Their achievements, whether monumental causeways, complex canal grids, concentric civic centers, or carefully tended forest gardens, are testaments to human adaptability and creativity. To stand on one of these raised platforms is to feel a continuity with those who stood there before. Your breath mixes with the same humid air, your feet press soil they pressed, your eyes may catch the same shaft of light that once lit a ritual mask. That is where wonder lives, not in the idea of lost cities as exotic spectacles, but in the realization that across centuries, different peoples answered life's same questions in ways both similar and strikingly inventive. Finally, we circle back to the injunction that began this narrative, that LiDAR's revelation is an invitation not to possess but to steward. These are living landscapes. Many are located on lands still used and revered by descendants whose identities were not washed away by time. Archaeology, when done ethically, amplifies rather than erases their claims. It should partner in the protection of sites from looting and in the documentation and revitalization of cultural memory. It should also broaden public understanding, beyond the headlines of giants and lost empires, toward a deeper respect for the labor and imagination that shaped these places. The mysteries we have traced are not puzzles to be solved in isolation. They are part of an ongoing human conversation about how to live with water, how to move across a landscape that both resists and yields, and how to create meaning in community. There is a tenderness in imagining a small child centuries ago picking up a broken bead and pocketing it, or an artisan shaping a bead with painstaking rhythm, or an elder calling the community together for a maintenance ritual, small acts that, in aggregate, made plazas and canals possible. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.